me on my knees, Layla. Begging, darling, please, Layla.
Few songs stir the soul like Eric Clapton's Layla. It's dramatic, emotional, and instantly iconic. Yet the story of how it came to life has always been wrapped in tension. For years, whispers circulated about where the haunting piano coda really came from, and why one musician felt her work had been taken without a trace of acknowledgment. Her version was pushed aside, brushed off, and buried. But now, 55 years later, Clapton is finally breaking his silence. And his explanation reveals a truth about Layla that fans never imagined. The early life no one knows. It's 1945 in Surrey, England, and Eric Clapton enters the world under circumstances wrapped in secrecy. From the very beginning, his life stands on an unstable foundation, one built on a story that wasn't quite true. As a young boy, he grows up believing he has parents who are much older than most and a sister named Patricia. It feels ordinary enough until it suddenly isn't. Just before his teenage years, everything he thought he knew is shattered. His family sits him down and reveals that the people he called mom and dad were actually his grandparents, and Patricia, the girl he believed was his sister, was in fact his mother. It's an emotional earthquake at a time when childhood is already starting to slip away. Patricia had become pregnant at just 16, and the father, a Canadian serviceman named Edward Fryer, left England before Eric was born. He drifted through life playing piano in bars, and Eric would never meet him. The discovery of his real parentage, and the silence where a father should have been, left a mark that followed him for years. Growing up, Clapton was quiet, thoughtful, and introverted. But the truth about his family deepened that introversion, turning him distant and moody. Schoolwork slipped through his fingers, grades fell apart. But one thing remained steady: his passion for art. Then something unexpected happened. At 13, he caught sight of Jerry Lee Lewis tearing through great balls of fire on television. It was electricity on a screen, and it hit him like destiny. He asked for a guitar and got one. But playing it didn't come easy at first. It hurt, it resisted him, and for a moment he stepped away from it. Art school brought him back to the strings. By then, American blues had drifted across the Atlantic, heavy, soulful, and irresistible. Clapton fell into it head first. He recorded himself constantly, listened back, corrected mistakes, chased perfection one bend and slide at a time. The guitar changed from hobby to obsession, and soon people around him could hear it. School, however, fell by the wayside. His artistic talent couldn't keep pace with his musical hunger, and eventually he was asked to leave. He didn't mourn it. By day, he worked for his grandfather to make ends meet. By night, he chased music like oxygen. His first band, the Roosters, barely lasted a year, but the momentum never stopped. He reconnected with former art school acquaintance Keith Relf and blues devotee Paul Samuel Smith, a spark that led him into the Yardbirds, a band destined to launch legendary guitarists into the world. Clapton, fueled by influences like Buddy Guy and B.B. King, hit London's Crawdaddy Club with raw power that stunned audiences. It was here that he earned the nickname Slowhand. Whenever Clapton broke a string mid-performance, he replaced it right there on stage, carefully and without hurry. The crowd would fill the gap with a slow, rhythmic applause, and manager Giorgio Gamelski turned that moment into a name that followed Clapton for life. But just as his star began to rise, he felt himself pulling away. At 20, the Yardbirds released For Your Love, a hit that pushed the band toward commercial success. Clapton wanted blues, pure, emotional, unpolished, and he had no interest in chasing pop stardom. So on the very day the single took off, he walked away. Bandmates later admitted they weren't devastated. Clapton, they said, was brilliant but moody, withdrawn, hard to reach. His departure brought relief more than grief. The vacancy he left was filled by Jeff Beck and later Jimmy Page, two future giants in rock history, a sign of the kind of company Clapton kept even at the start. And while he may have stepped out of one spotlight, he was already moving toward another, bigger one. Night after night, he's on stage earning a loyal following, and the band is tracing the path the Rolling Stones had already carved out, even landing their own residency at the Crawdaddy Club, the same room where the Stones once rattled the walls. But Clapton is restless. He leaves the Yardbirds and steps into the role of lead guitarist for John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers. It's here that his name explodes. The moment that proves it, an anonymous fan spray paints Clapton as God across a London wall. No autograph, no explanation, just 3 words that take on a life of their own. A myth is born, and it's still alive decades later. Then comes 1966. Clapton isn't tied to any band for a minute, just floating, watching, waiting. One night after a gig, Ginger Baker, already a powerhouse drummer, offers him a ride home. The drive ends with an offer that changes rock history. Baker wants to form a band, and not just any band, a new kind of group built around virtuosos. Clapton is intrigued, but he has one condition: Jack Bruce has to be involved. That single request nearly gets him killed. Baker and Bruce, after all, have history, the ugly kind. They'd already shared a stage in the Graham Bond organization, and they fought as often as they played, sabotaging each other's gear, screaming backstage, even brawling mid-performance. Eventually, Baker kicks Bruce out, but Bruce keeps showing up anyway. Things get so bad that Baker ends up threatening him with a knife if he ever returned. That finally does the trick. So when Clapton casually suggests Jack Bruce, Baker nearly drives the car off the road. Yet the idea of a true supergroup is too powerful to ignore. By the summer of 1966, egos are swallowed, tempers restrained, just barely, and the 3 musicians unite. They call themselves Cream because they believe they are the very best rising to the surface of British blues. And honestly, they might have been right. Cream only records 4 albums, but the impact is massive. Their sound becomes a new flavor of rock, heavy, blues-rooted, electric, and they turn out classics like Sunshine of Your Love from their second album, Disraeli Gears, a track that storms its way into the Billboard Top 5. With Cream, Clapton doesn't just secure his reputation. He becomes a map point in rock history. Bold, unmistakable, permanent. How fame fueled his inner collapse. Before Cream, Eric Clapton was known mostly in Britain for his work with the Yardbirds. But Cream changed everything. When he joined the band, his name didn't just grow, it exploded across the Atlantic, placing him firmly in the global spotlight. Cream wasn't just playing the blues. They were twisting it, electrifying it, and drenching it in psychedelia. Clapton stood front and center with his wild paint-splashed guitar known as the Fool, shaping a sound that felt like a new universe. And the hype? That became a story of its own. In North London, someone spray-painted those legendary words on a brick wall: "Clapton is God." A photo of the graffiti later became iconic, mostly because a dog just happened to be caught in the frame, relieving itself right on the tribute. It was cheeky, ironic, but also perfectly fitting for the way fans saw him at the time. Yet divine or not, Clapton soon found out he wasn't unstoppable. Cream, despite being a powerhouse trio, had one fatal flaw. They were loud, too loud. The volume wars inside the band were infamous. Jack Bruce would crank his amp stacks to unbelievable levels, and Ginger Baker fought to keep up. The stage often became a battlefield of sound, and Clapton was stuck right in the middle of it. At one gig, he actually stopped playing completely. Neither of his bandmates noticed. That said more about Cream's chaos than any interview ever could. Physically and mentally, Clapton was wearing down. The endless touring, the noise, the conflict between Bruce and Baker, it all chipped away at him. They were playing 6 nights a week, and slowly, he began to burn out. His weight dropped to around 125 pounds, and he later admitted that he felt and looked like death. Instead of feeling challenged by the music, he felt trapped inside it, forced into the exhausting role of referee while trying to hold the music together. Those tensions weren't a secret. Supergroups often collapse under the weight of their own brilliance, and Cream was the perfect example. Whenever people talked about them, offstage drama came up as quickly as musical genius. Bruce and Baker clashed relentlessly, and Clapton felt like the only thing standing between them. He described his situation as constantly confrontational, saying he spent half his time just trying to keep the peace. He told their manager repeatedly that he wanted out. Every time he was convinced to wait just one more week. But then he heard something that changed everything. Somewhere in the flood of bootlegs floating around in 1967, Clapton discovered a set of raw, rootsy recordings from a group of largely unknown Canadian musicians who had recently backed Bob Dylan. They were called the Hawks at the time, but soon the world would know them simply as the band. Their sound shook him. It was stripped down, honest, unpolished. A friend later played him their debut album, Music from Big Pink, and Clapton said it rocked him to the core. Suddenly he knew exactly what he wanted, and Cream wasn't it. For him, the band represented the kind of music he felt starved for: grounded, soulful, real. Cream, meanwhile, had become famous for extended solos, psychedelic swirl, and sheer noise. Clapton summed it up simply. When he finally got everything he thought he wanted, he realized he didn't want it anymore. The band became his reason, his exit door, proof that he could walk away and start fresh. Then came the blow that sealed the deal. A Rolling Stone critic called him a master of the blues cliché, tearing into Cream in a way that hit every insecurity Clapton already had. That review hurt. To fans, he was God, but he was also a young man already burnt out, stretched thin, and suddenly unsure of what his music had become. It was the final push. In May 1968, Cream split. They played a few final shows, recorded a farewell record titled Goodbye, and took to the Royal Albert Hall one last time that November. But even the curtain fall wasn't smooth. At their final U.S. concert, they arrived late and only managed to play 2 songs, Toad and a 20-minute version of Spoonful. Critics later said their last shows felt flat, like a band already gone in spirit. Ginger Baker himself admitted they weren't at their best. They all knew the end had come. It was just a matter of finishing the job. And for Clapton, ending Cream didn't bring peace. Instead, it opened the door to a new whirlwind. He moved straight into Blind Faith, another supergroup stacked with talent. Baker again, Steve Winwood of Traffic, and Rick Gretsch of Family. Audiences loved them immediately, but the band barely had enough material to play a full concert. Clapton dissolved the group almost as quickly as it formed. Baker didn't even know it was over until he came back from holiday. Cream had burned him out. Blind Faith came and went, and this was only the beginning. The chaos in Clapton's life was nowhere near finished. By the late 1960s, Eric Clapton was in his mid-20s, already famous, already troubled, and about to be swept into one of the most chaotic chapters of his life. This was when he met 17-year-old Alice Ormsby Gore, a young British aristocrat who moved easily through London's social scene. And in true Clapton fashion, things escalated fast. Within weeks, Alice was practically living with him, and the relationship flickered constantly between passion and volatility. But beneath the glamour of the rock scene, something far darker was unfolding. Around the time their relationship began, Clapton plunged into heavy substance use, and he pulled Alice with him. She adored him deeply and painfully, even as he showed only wavering interest. She often ran out to score for them both, later explaining that she felt she was sparing him from facing the full horror of feeding his own addiction. Yet even her devotion couldn't shield them from what was coming. They preferred the kind of high that left them nodding off. And while they narrowly avoided injecting during this period, something that kept Clapton just functional enough to keep playing, his career was moving forward even as his personal life unraveled. He formed Derek and the Dominoes and brought in Duane Allman, whose slide guitar would define their sound. But the band's short life was marked by staggering tragedy. While they were still recording their debut album, Clapton was shattered by the sudden death of his friend and musical idol, Jimi Hendrix, who overdosed on barbiturates. Clapton had just bought Hendrix a left-handed Fender Stratocaster as a birthday gift. He carried that grief into the Dominoes tour, moving through it in a haze of drugs. Then, another devastating blow came. Duane Allman, whom Clapton called the musical brother he never had, died in a motorcycle crash in October 1971. The loss hit him hard, and the emotional weight only grew heavier. Even within the Dominoes themselves, there were dark undercurrents. Their drummer, Jim Gordon, behaved violently and erratically, long before anyone realized he was suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia. Years later, those voices in his head would lead him to take his mother's life. Amid all this, Clapton continued to spiral. The Dominoes fell apart after a stormy recording session, leaving him alone with his grief, frustration, and deepening addictions. He and Alice withdrew into reclusive drug use, disappearing almost entirely from public view. His addiction soon forced him into a career hiatus. He resurfaced briefly at the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, but it was a disaster. Clapton was so impaired he collapsed on stage and had to be physically shaken awake to finish the performance. Later, he admitted that he'd been in absolute denial, convinced he could quit anytime, even as his life unraveled. By 1973, even his closest friends couldn't ignore the severity of his decline. Pete Townshend of The Who orchestrated the Rainbow Concert, dragging Clapton back into the spotlight in the hopes of jump-starting his recovery. But one concert wasn't enough, because the roots of Clapton's torment reached far deeper than drugs or fame. Behind the scenes was a heartbreak that had been consuming him for years. While he was still with Alice, he had grown close to George Harrison and fallen completely in love with Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. That love, impossible and overwhelming, would become one of rock and roll's most infamous triangles and the emotional fault line running beneath Clapton's unraveling world. The muse who sparked rock feuds. In the late 1960s, two of the greatest guitarists of their generation found themselves caught in an emotional tug-of-war over the same woman. That woman was Pattie Boyd, one of the era's most recognizable models, and at the time the wife of George Harrison. For anyone who may not instantly recognize her name, Pattie Boyd's influence is impossible to miss. She became the muse behind some of the most iconic songs in rock history. On one side was George Harrison, the quiet but deeply expressive lead guitarist of the Beatles. On the other was Eric Clapton, already hailed as a guitar prodigy and rapidly carving out his own legendary path with Cream and, soon after, as a solo artist. Clapton's feelings for Pattie were no secret, at least not to himself. His growing obsession fueled an extraordinary burst of creativity. While George expressed his love in his own way, writing the timeless ballad Something for Pattie during their marriage, Clapton responded with a musical declaration of his own. His love letter came in the form of Layla, a fiery, haunting masterpiece recorded with his new supergroup, Derek and the Dominoes. In his autobiography, Clapton later admitted just how consumed he was at the time, explaining that much of the Dominoes' first album revolved around Pattie and his longing for her. Layla itself was his attempt to speak directly to her feelings, to confront the space that still separated them. Before the world heard the song, Pattie received a private premiere. Clapton had already told her he was in love with her, and now he played her this deeply personal track 3 times in a row, before finally asking what she thought. She worried people would immediately guess the song was about her, but that never quite happened. What did happen was that the emotional weight of the moment broke down her hesitation. She was moved, deeply, and her resistance to Clapton's advances finally slipped away. Later that evening, things escalated even further. Pattie went to a party without George. Clapton arrived too, and the two spent much of the night together. When George eventually appeared and saw how close they seemed, the tension snapped. Clapton walked right up to him and confessed that he was in love with George's wife. But the roots of this complicated story stretched back several years earlier to 1964, on the set of A Hard Day's Night. Pattie was working as a schoolgirl extra when she first met George Harrison. She was already dating someone at the time, Yet there was an instant spark between them. George felt it too. During their very first conversation, he jokingly asked her to marry him, a playful line that surprisingly would become reality only a few years later. After a period of dating, Pattie and George married in 1966. Not long into their marriage, George wrote something for her, capturing the tenderness he felt. But even with all that beauty and devotion, their relationship soon began to fracture. In 1968, the Beatles set off for their now famous trip to India, hoping to immerse themselves in the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's teachings and explore deeper spiritual ideas. The plan was to stay for 3 months, but the visit came to an abrupt end after allegations of sexual misconduct surfaced against the Maharishi. John Lennon later explained that while they still believed in transcendental meditation, the visit to that particular ashram had been a mistake. After returning home, George Harrison threw himself even more intensely into yoga and mystical practices. But these new interests began changing him in ways that put real strain on his marriage. Pattie Boyd, his wife, watched as George became fascinated by how some yogis lived with stable concubines. When he came back to England, he carried that fascination into his own life, becoming openly unfaithful. For Pattie, the emotional fallout was overwhelming. Her vulnerability didn't go unnoticed. Eric Clapton, a close friend of George's, stepped into the growing distance between husband and wife. Pattie sensed George's interest in other women, particularly when he invited one of Clapton's former girlfriends to stay with them shortly after her breakup with Eric. George insisted she simply needed support, but Pattie quickly realized the woman wasn't heartbroken at all. She was spending far too much time with George. Eventually, Pattie reached her breaking point. She walked out, telling George she wouldn't come home until the woman was gone. Not long after, George called to confirm she had left and Pattie returned. But the incident was only a symptom of a much deeper problem. George increasingly seemed open to bringing other women into their lives, and Pattie was being left behind emotionally. During this painful period, Clapton started appearing at George's home more frequently. Outwardly, he was just a friend coming over to play music, but in hindsight, it's clear he was also trying to get closer to Pattie. Though shy at first, he began paying attention to the small details that George no longer noticed. Knowing he couldn't have Pattie, Clapton redirected his affections toward her teenage sister Paula, whom he had met in 1969. Sparks flew immediately, and she soon moved into his mansion. But even with Paula there, Clapton remained fixated on Pattie. It was in the middle of this turmoil that Clapton wrote one of rock's most iconic songs. Before sharing it with Pattie, he sent her a dramatic anonymous letter, signed only with an E, asking whether she still loved her husband. Pattie initially assumed it was from an overzealous fan and dismissed his confession. Even though she admitted later that his offer was tempting, she felt it wouldn't be right to leave George. Rejected and heartbroken, Clapton poured his anguish into his music. As Derek and the Dominoes released Layla, he reached the peak of his career, channeling his emotional torment into every note. Inspired by the ancient tale of Layla and Majnun, a story of forbidden love and lifelong longing, Clapton reimagined himself as Majnun, hopelessly in love with someone he could not have. The song's lyrics carried the full weight of his heartbreak. Clapton later wrote in his autobiography that he hoped Pattie would hear the album and be moved enough to leave George. She knew exactly what the song meant. He had even called her Layla before. But instead of bringing clarity, it left her frightened. She was flattered but terrified that George would discover the truth behind the music. Though the tension continued for some time, this period marked a turning point for Clapton. How Eric won Pattie's heart. 1974 ended up being a turning point for Eric Clapton, a year marked by both redemption and upheaval. Thanks to an intervention led by Pete Townsend of The Who and Alice Ormsby Gore's father, Clapton finally stepped back from the edge and began getting clean. And as clarity slowly returned, so did the music. Within just a few years, he released major classics like I Shot the Sheriff and the Slow Hand album, cementing a new chapter in his career. But while Clapton was putting his life back together, His personal world was shifting in dramatic ways. His long, complicated connection to Pattie Boyd, already the muse behind Layla, was about to be rekindled. Boyd's marriage to George Harrison had survived Clapton's early declarations of love, but it couldn't withstand the infidelities and emotional distance that came later. By 1974, the foundation of their relationship had cracked beyond repair. Clapton sensed it, and in true rock and roll fashion, he made one final theatrical bid for Pattie's heart. According to actor John Hurt, Clapton and Harrison actually ended up in a real guitar duel at Harrison's estate, Friar Park. Hurt described the scene as tense and electric, with everyone too stunned to speak. Pattie later confirmed the strange showdown, even though Clapton himself has brushed it off in interviews. Whether or not he took it seriously, the moment mattered. Because that same year, Pattie finally chose to leave George for good. Of course, her decision wasn't based solely on the duel. Pattie had just discovered that George was having an affair with Maureen Starkey, the wife of his bandmate Ringo Starr. She later called that betrayal the final straw. The divorce wouldn't be finalized until 1977, but Clapton was already waiting in the wings when her marriage collapsed. As Pattie and George drifted apart, Clapton drew her closer. He invited her to join him on tour, and in that same period, inspiration struck. In 1977, he released one of his most enduring songs, "Wonderful Tonight." With its gentle, understated lyrics, the ballad captured a simple, private moment between them, Pattie agonizing over what to wear for a night out, and Clapton waiting patiently downstairs. Pattie later revealed in her memoir that she had taken ages switching outfits, tossing dresses onto the floor, as Clapton quietly worked out the song that would become a timeless classic. Yet her feelings about the song were layered. Pattie admitted she was flattered to have inspired such music from both Clapton and George, but she eventually realized the songs were less about her and more about what these artists drew from their own emotional worlds. As she put it, creative people often dig into the deepest corners of themselves to craft their art, and that process can be painful for those caught in the middle. For her, "Wonderful Tonight" became both a touching reminder of the good times and a painful echo when their relationship struggled. Still, despite the turbulence that followed, Pattie and Clapton married in 1979. In an unusual twist even for rock history, George Harrison seemed entirely at peace with the situation. He even affectionately referred to Clapton as his husband-in-law, a nickname that still surprises fans today. But not everyone believes the story ends with ordinary human drama. Over the years, some people have claimed there was something far stranger behind this famous love triangle, voodoo. According to these outlandish theories, Clapton supposedly learned mystical practices from musician Dr. John, who allegedly gave him a love potion to use on Pattie. And, so the story goes, that same magic explained how George and Eric managed to remain friends afterward. It's a bizarre myth, of course, but its persistence shows just how captivated people remain by this tangled chapter in rock history. For some, the real heartbreaks and human complexities weren't dramatic enough, so folklore filled the gaps. And in these legends, Clapton's long-dreamed-of love was not only won through supernatural means, but ultimately turned into a curse of its own. Eric Clapton's darkest years revealed. At the start of the 1980s, it looked as though Eric Clapton was standing firmly on solid ground. He had shaken one addiction, married Pattie Boyd, and seemed poised to build an even greater musical legacy. But beneath that polished surface, his world was quietly coming undone. While he had walked away from one destructive habit, he was sinking rapidly into another: alcohol. Everything came crashing together around Christmas of 1981. Clapton finally called his manager and confessed what he could no longer hide. He was a heavy drinker who desperately needed help. Even then, the journey forward was far from steady. On the flight to a rehab clinic in Minnesota, he drank heavily, terrified of facing a future without alcohol to numb the pain he carried. In his autobiography, he later revealed a chilling truth. The only reason he didn't take his own life was because, in his words, he wouldn't have been able to drink if he were dead. By the time the plane landed, staff practically had to carry him into treatment. Rehab brought a battle that pushed him to his limits. Clapton was a man who clung tightly to his convictions, and that stubbornness extended to his addictions. He managed to keep releasing music, but his recovery was shaky at best. He left his first stint already close to relapsing. His frustration was so overwhelming that he titled his 1984 album Money and Cigarettes, saying that was all he felt he had left. It ultimately took another round of treatment in 1987 to bring him to long-term sobriety. But by then, the emotional wreckage in his personal life was already severe. Pattie Boyd, celebrated muse to both Clapton and George Harrison, found herself living a far darker reality than the romantic myth surrounding the famous love triangle suggested. Once she married Clapton, she quickly realized that she had become just another woman in his orbit. The same infidelity that strained her marriage to Harrison resurfaced with Clapton. But the betrayals soon cut much deeper. Boyd had spent years struggling to have children with Harrison, and she faced the same heartbreaking challenges with Clapton. In 1984, they turned to IVF, clinging to the hope of finally becoming parents. Instead, they endured a series of devastating miscarriages. During this painful period, Clapton began an affair with Yvonne Kelly, a woman who was also married at the time. Kelly became pregnant, and in early 1985, she gave birth to a daughter, Ruth, just as Boyd was undergoing IVF treatments. Rather than seeing this as a turning point, Clapton spiraled even further. He soon started a new affair with Italian model Lori Del Santo, who became pregnant as well. Their son Connor was born in 1986. By this point, Clapton had fathered 2 children outside his marriage, while Boyd continued grieving the pregnancies she lost. In the years that followed, Clapton opened up about the darkest chapters of their marriage. In 1999, he admitted to physically assaulting Boyd during drunken arguments and forcing intimacy on her. Boyd eventually escaped the marriage, and they divorced in 1989. Only 2 years later, fate delivered a blow more devastating than anything Clapton had ever experienced. In 1991, 4-year-old Connor fell from an open window in a Manhattan apartment and died. Clapton had been in New York at the time, having taken his son to the circus the night before. When Connor's mother called him in terror, he rushed to the apartment and witnessed the aftermath from a distance. In his memoir, he described walking down Park Avenue in disbelief, trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood the tragedy unfolding before him. The grief that followed was overwhelming, and he poured that anguish into his music. From that heartbreak came one of his most iconic songs, Tears in Heaven, written in memory of his son. But sorrow continued to find its way back into his life. In 1995, Alice Ormsby Gore, an old girlfriend who had once been entwined in his darkest struggles with addiction, died at the age of 42 after years of fighting her own demons. Her death served as yet another painful reminder of the chaos and destruction that had followed him for so long. 55 years later, Eric Clapton reveals the true meaning of Layla. Eric Clapton's Layla is one of those songs that feels larger than life, an anthem instantly recognized around the world. Officially, the writing credit belongs to Clapton and his bandmate Jim Gordon. But behind that tidy attribution sits a controversy that refuses to fade. At the heart of the dispute is the song's soaring piano coda, that unforgettable melody that closes the track. According to Bobby Whitlock, a fellow member of Derek and the Dominoes, that beautiful section wasn't Gordon's creation at all. He claims Gordon took it without permission from his former girlfriend, singer-songwriter Rita Coolidge. In Whitlock's words, Gordon had simply stolen her work. Rita Coolidge later stepped forward to confirm that the story runs even deeper. In 2016, she publicly shared her version of events, and she didn't mince words. She recalled the moment she and Gordon met with Clapton to play him a demo of a piece she had co-written. They handed it over, hopeful and excited, but after that meeting, everything went silent. A year later, Coolidge suddenly heard that same melody, her melody, echoing through a sound system. It was now the iconic piano ending of Layla. Shocked, she reached out for answers. Instead of clarity, she was met with a blunt dismissal. Clapton's manager, Robert Stigwood, took her call and shut down any attempt to discuss the matter. His response was as harsh as it was dismissive. What could she possibly do about it? She was a young woman with no resources to fight a battle like this. His message was unmistakable. She should simply drop it. Decades later, Coolidge maintains that she never received acknowledgment from Clapton, not even a phone call. Still, she believes he knows exactly what happened. And while the world continues to celebrate Layla, the story behind its creation remains tangled in dispute, silence, and a melody that may have been taken from the person who wrote it.